So anyway, of course, today, like I said, I'm going to, of course, talk about the major events of the Middle Ages. And of course, I'm going to continue talking about primarily the later part of the Middle Ages. This is kind of getting to the high to late Middle Ages, which I will first talk about the Mongols, who they were. I'll talk about the Timurid Empire, and then I'll get into the major events that happened in the late Middle Ages, like the Black Death, 100 Years' War. And I should be able to go ahead and just cover also a little bit on the Renaissance as well. So you got the invasion of the Mongols that you have, of course, in Europe. The Mongol Empire formed in the early part of the 13th century. It was a Eurasian type empire that was founded by the Mongols. Who were the Mongols? The Mongols were Asiatic peoples. They came out of Mongolia. They were known for being very nomadic, fighting on horseback with like composite bow and sword. And the Mongols have been around a long time. They kind of went back to, ancient China, and it actually threatened ancient China at one point, like attacked them. Of course, the Mongols were called all kinds of names. Some people called them the Mongol horde. I use that term horde to describe their culture and the invasions of the Mongols, which described like just the thousands of them that would blot out the landscape as horsemen. Of course, Golden Horde was a term I'll talk about later that was also used in Russia. And then also the Devil's Horseman was another term that they used as well, because a lot of people thought they were sent by like the devil to attack them. All of that. Mongol Empire, about, was one of the largest empires in the world. One of the largest continuous empires that was built over a short period of time in the 13th century. And its peak of size was almost 10 million square miles. It was huge. 9 to 10 million, I think, is the range, about how big it was. And it was second largest to the British Empire. I think the three biggest empires that ever formed was probably the British Empire, the Mongol Empire, and the Russian Empire. So British Empire was the biggest ever, which was all around the world. And then the Mongol Empire stretched from like East Asia all the way to like they think Poland at one point. So it was a huge empire, and it did have a founder. Of course, the founder of the Mongol Empire was Genghis Khan, whose real name is Temujin. They also call him Chinggis Khan. It's called different names. I think that first part of the name. And Genghis Khan was like the first, what they call Great Khan. Khan was what they call the leaders of the Mongols, which a Khan was like a term meaning either leader or ruler. Khan meant like an emperor or king. So he's like an emperor of the empire. And he was the one that actually united all the tribes. And they started to attack parts of Asia, like China. And Genghis Khan was actually a title that meant universal leader or universal ruler. So it's kind of like a emperor, more or less, basically. And you can see here, that's the areas that they controlled at one point. And Genghis Khan formed the empire like in the early part of the 1200s, within like a 20-year period, very, very fast. And it stretched into China. They took like all over China. They took over all of Korea, Persia, you can see, Russia, Turkey, Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, Poland, all those areas they actually at one point occupied. So a massive area we're talking about that the Mongols, of course, were known for. The Mongols were, by the way, famous for committing mass genocide as they conquered vast amounts of territory, which they're not sure how many people that they killed in their conquest, but I've got close to 40 million. I don't know if that's really accurate or not. But they do think that they, like in China, they wiped out half the population. I think in Russia, they also did the same thing, wiped out a lot of people as they basically conquered territory. Do have some maps showing like the areas that they took over. You can see here's a map showing the actual continuous expansion of the actual empire as it pushed westward and through Asia. And I guess Genghis Khan probably conquered, I would say, at least 3/4 of the empire more in a very short time, like 1206. You can see it starts, and Genghis Khan died in 1227. So that's like in a 20-21 year period. They conquered most of that territory overall. Genghis Khan, of course, is still, a major hero, in Mongolia today. So a lot of people still look up to him and all that. Now, after he died, Genghis Khan, his empire broke up. Like his sons and grandsons eventually divided the whole thing up. And they eventually were divided into like these 4 khanates, which were like kingdoms or states. And those are the 4 right there. They got the Yuan one, which is called different names. I think called sometimes the Khanate of the Great Khan, which included Mongol, China, and all of that was kind of in it. Mongolia and China mostly was in it. And then the Golden Horde was an area that was mostly like Russia and the part of the Ukraine was in it. Chagatai was like Central Asia, around where Turkestan is or used to be. And then Ilkhanate was like where Persia is, like Iran, Iraq mostly, in that area. The Yuan dynasty formed, of course, out of China, which was a dynasty that controlled primarily Mongolia, China, and Korea. This was like a Mongol dynasty, and it was founded by Kublai Khan, who was one of Genghis Khan's grandsons. And the Mongols actually ruled over China for over 100-something years until 1368. So they were in China a long time. Here's the years that Genghis Khan reigned, about 1271 to 1294. And under him, under the Mongols, Beijing started really to become like the capital of China, which it would pretty much later. So that's who Kublai Khan was. And Kublai Khan was around the same time as when Marco Polo was around, because Marco Polo would later go to, Asia and meet him, and that started a lot of trade between Asia and Europe, of course, later. Then they had the Golden Horde Khanate. That was a Mongol state that was founded by Batu Khan, who was one of Genghis Khan's grandsons. The Golden Horde Khanate was a Russian vassal state that was under the Mongols. They basically had to pay tribute to the Mongols. And what's interesting, when the Mongols pushed westward, like throughout Asia and Europe, they hired these mercenaries, which were Turks, which were called Tatars in Russia. And over time, the two cultures would kind of mix, the Mongols and the Turks. They become one culture eventually. And there's different theories about why in Russia they call them Golden Horde. The one common name, one common reason is because of the fact that the Russians had to pay, their masters like money to pay them off like gold tribute, unless they would, attack them. And so that was another theory, was that they lived in these golden tents or golden colored tents. Hence that name. I don't know. I think may have been the latter, but either one's fine, I guess, or why that is. Then you see where the Ilkhanate, that state is right there, where it says Persia. Eventually, they had a state that would emerge there later that was called the Timurid Empire that would eventually form. And this state was actually formed by this ruler who was kind of a mix. It's going out on me. I don't know why it does that. It doesn't want to stay. But we'll stay there, buddy. I don't know what's wrong with it. But anyway, but it was called the Timurid Empire. And anyway, it was this type of state that was a mix of Turks and Mongols. Because over time, the two, like I told you, had merged together as a culture. And of course, the Turks converted to Islam. And so this state became like this Islamic type state that controlled territory that stretched from what is Iraq all the way to like the Indus River Basin. And it had a founder. The founder was named Timur, known as Timur the Lame, they called him. But later in the West, the Crusaders and others later kind of called him Tamerlane. So it's like a variation of the name Tamer the Lame. It became Tamerlane. You get that. He started the empire like in the late 14th century, and the state would be around until close to about the 16th century. They kind of went up to like early modern times. You can see the area controlled Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan were all the areas that actually established at one point. And this state eventually gave birth to another state later. You may have heard of the Mughal Empire that was later, which took over India. The Mughals was the state that kind of broke away from it because they went in and took over what is India, the 16th century. And there was a ruler named Babur, was his name, who was also a Turco-Mongol type, ruler. He formed the state, and that's the one that built the Taj Mahal, which is a famous building that they built in India later. And so Timurid empires in that Mughal empire were one of several of these Islamic type states that formed direct around the Middle East and in part of the East as well. So that's how Islam kind of gets into India, where Pakistan is, and all of that. There, of course, is a picture of course, Tamerlane or Timur, of course, on the right. You can see the extent of his empire went from like the Euphrates Tigris River basin. You can see it like around Iran, the Caspian Sea, all the way into Persia and Afghanistan and part of Pakistan, etc. All right, so let me go ahead and move on next. Of course, I want to get into some like the major events that happened, of course, in the late Middle Ages, like 1300s to like the 1500s. And of course, one of the big things that happened in the late Middle Ages, there was a bunch of events that happened that were very, very famous. Of course, that's well known in that time period. At least three big things I'll talk about, which were pretty famous. These, of course, are the Black Death, which you saw a little short video in which I'll talk about today, which had to do with the Bubonic Plague, 100 Years' War, which was mostly in France, fought between England and France. And then, of course, the most famous event that happened, of course, at the end of the Middle Ages was the Renaissance. So we'll talk about the Black Death first, which has all kinds of names, of course, that they called it. The Black Death, of course, like I said, was a major pandemic, of course, that broke out in the mid-14th century. Of course, it was a massive pandemic, kind of like what's going on now with the coronavirus, COVID. Of course, killed millions worldwide. They think it may have killed as many as 100 million people worldwide in history. It wiped out a third of the European population, like they said in the video. They think maybe 20 million or more actually died in Europe. That's a lot of people that eventually died. Like they said in the video, it basically spread through the trade routes, likely coming down like the Silk Road, also going by sea, because ships brought it to Europe. About this. They've had similar plagues before, like the video talked about. Plague of Justinian was, of course, an example, which wiped out a good amount of people in Europe and part of Western Asia as well, because they think it originated in the East, and all that. Is the theory is like maybe China, maybe where it started, like the coronavirus did, and all that. Here's, of course, talking about like where it started and how it got going. Well, they think that it spread from the Black Sea because of the trade routes. They think that Italian traders, like in mostly Genoan, brought it to Europe via ships. They think it first spread through all the ports in Europe. And then from the southern part of Europe, it spread up through the northern part of Europe. Here's a map showing you the spread of the bubonic plague as it went from south to north. They think it started in Sicily, in southern Italy, and then spread up through like Spain, France, Germany, Britain, and up through Scandinavia. at one point. They do think it may have affected like parts of like the North Africa, like part of the Mediterranean Sea, and all of that. So that's how it basically spread, and so on. And of course, in modern times, they figured out what caused it. It was caused by a type of plague bacillus, like a bacterium that lived in rat fleas. And the actual bacterium was discovered in the 1890s by the Swiss-French physician named Alexandre Yersin. Against the actual name of the bacterium that was called Yersinia pestis, as they called it. Yeah, it spread by rat fleas, and the rat carried it. The flea, I guess, would bite people and give you the bacterium, which would, of course, give you the plague. Of course, that's how it worked. Although it's kind of debated about, they seem to think that there were different ways that you could have gotten the plague. They think that, yeah, it could have been from getting bit by a flea, but also they believe it was also carried through the air, something they figured out, and also by touch, by touching something that has the actual bacterium on it, and then you put it to your face or whatever, and of course you get it that way also as well. Like when you touch like a fomite, which is like any kind of inanimate object that might have bacteria or virus on it. Kind of like today, like you touch a doorknob or something like that. You could literally get it that way also as well. So there's different methods that you could have gotten it besides being bitten by a flea. Why was it called bubonic plague? A lot of it had to do with the fact that the victims would get these swelling of the lymph nodes that would fill up with pus and blood, which was around like your groin area, around your armpits, around your necks. And that was usually signs that you had the bubonic plague. Other symptoms, they'd have high fever, coughing up blood, think runny feces, things like that. And a lot of people would get it and they'd die real quick, within a week or less. So it was pretty quick when you got it. In some people's case, they die within a day or two sometimes if they got it also as well. The term Black Death was not, or Black Plague, either one they used, was not coined till later. 1600s is when they started using the term originally, because the term Black Death originated from the fact that so many people died. They were so depressed from all the dead people everywhere. They practically had to bury people either in mass graves, and in some cases they even burned their bodies also as well. Medieval people often called it the Great Pestilence or Great Plague. Some people call it the Great Death or Great Mortality. The fact that so many people, of course, died. And they've had plagues come back again and again. Like if you ever study about the Great Plague of London that hit in the late 17th century, that was considered one of the last great outbreaks that they had, which killed something like 100,000 people, like in London alone. It was under the reign of King Charles II. And that's actually where that whole song comes from, if you may have heard of, which is Ring Around the Rosie. Hear that song that people used to sing? Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes to ashes, we all fall down. Yeah, that comes from the Great Plague of London. It was a famous English nursery rhyme that they, of course, would recite, which is about the plague. So, of course, some people would wear masks, and all that too, because they thought that whatever they were breathing in would cause the plague and all of that. But most people, like I said, did not know what actually caused the plague for you to actually get it. And I'll talk about that briefly. What did medieval people think what caused the actual plague? Most was like non-medical, of course. But one was close, which was number one, breathing foul air, which is called miasma. There's this idea that you could breathe in like bad smells that might come from the earth or stagnant lakes or things like that. They were close, because you might breathe in bacteria or viruses, I guess. And so, yeah, they were close with that, but they didn't really think that until really, I guess, up into the late 19th century when people started thinking about germ theory and stuff like that. A lot of people thought that it was caused by either by God or the devil. Like God was punishing people's, punishing people for not going to church or things like that, or the devil was out to get people also as well. Witchcraft, like women were accused of basically causing it as well. So they think that led to the rise of like witch hunts, things like that. Jews, a lot of Jews were blamed for also the plague. So there was a rumor going around that Jews had poisoned all the wells and things like that. And so there were cases where a lot of Jews were also killed because they were blamed for it. Then a lot of the universities, like scholars, had another theory that it was caused by astrology, and that the planets had kind of lined up, like in conjunction or something like that. Actually, scholars at the University of Paris had come up with that idea in the 14th century, which I don't think that was right either. So that's just stuff about the plague and all that that were very famous. There's the Bobo, and people still use that term Bobo, today to describe like you get a cut. They got a Bobo, and that's kind of where that comes from. All right, yeah, another topic I need to talk about, of course, is the 100 Years' War, which also occurred around the same time. It broke out in the 14th century as well, which went into the 15th century. So I'm going to talk about that next as well. What was the 100 Years' War? It was actually a war that was fought, or really a series of wars that were fought between England and France over 100-something years, which is why it was called the 100 Years' War. It was considered one of the longest wars in history, especially in medieval times. And it mostly was fought between these two dynasties that were in Europe. That was called the Plantagenet dynasty, which they sometimes call Angevin for short, and then the Valois. What was the difference between the two dynasties? The Plantagenets was a English dynasty that was, of course, the Kingdom of England. They went all the way back to King Henry II. He was one of their first kings that ruled England. And he was the father of King Richard I, the Lionheart, who we've talked about. Also, another king named King John, the one that was forced to sign the Magna Carta in England. So that's who we're talking about. The Plantagenets were pretty famous. It's probably considered one of the most famous medieval dynasties that you have in Europe. That's well known. Valois was another dynasty, that, of course, the French dynasty, which went back to the 13th century. And they were actually a branch, or a cadet branch of the Capetians, which the Capetians was the original dynasty of the Kingdom of France. They went back to the 10th century, who were named for Hugh Capet, who was like the first king of France a long time ago. Why did the 100 Years' War break out? It was because of the fact that King Henry III of the Plantagenet dynasty had kind of this tentative claim to the French throne. He was related to the French, which a lot of the English and French were kind of related to each other, going back to the Duchy of Normandy a long time ago. And apparently what happened was the King of France died, who was Charles IV. It was basically his uncle. And he wanted the throne because he thought he was in line. And the fact that Charles IV didn't have a direct male heir. His sons he didn't have any sons, I guess they all died or whatever. But apparently what happened was the throne then went to one of his nephews instead. It was Charles IV. And so that's what happened. Edward III thought he was snubbed, basically. And so he eventually would try to seize the throne one way. And that was through, obviously, military means. Try to invade France and try to get it and all that. And so that's why basically the English would invade France, even though they actually controlled part of France already, close to Aquitaine. But they would invade through northern France and also western France to try to take it over. One thing that's very famous about the 100 Years' War is the war was famous for introducing a lot of new weapons, which is true about that. like the English introduced a new weapon that was very famous at that time called the longbow. I think I've got a picture showing the longbow. The longbow was a new type of weapon, which really revolutionized weaponry in fighting on the battlefield. And it was a 6-foot bow, I think 6 feet or longer, which could be basically used by anybody. Which, of course, you'll see later that a lot of people that actually used the longbow were mostly like the lower class peasants, which began to take part in warfare. And it played a major part in defeating a lot of the French early on in the war. It's part of why the French won. The French were defeated and the English won, I meant. And they was usually made from different oak type of trees, which not oak, but the yew tree. I think the yew tree was usually one of the types of wood they used, but they have used different woods to make it out of originally. Oh, also, the English were famous for introducing like the first cannon to be used in Europe, like primitive cannons. I think some were even handheld that they originated. Like the Battle of Crécy and a few other battles were battles where they first started using like cannon, which played a major role at the beginning of the war as well. A lot of the early cannons shot like grape shot or shot out like large size type arrows and so on. But over time, they'll switch to using also cannonballs and things like that. The French used cannon too as well in the war, but the French were very famous for developing like siege engines like the trebuchet, which you may have heard about, which was a type of catapult that could shoot up to projectiles that were 300 to 400 pounds each. And these could be used to basically knock down walls, take out fortresses and fortifications. And so a lot of that kind of helped to eventually with cannon later and things like that would make some fortifications like obsolete. Due to a lot of the English military superiority and also weaponry, by 1415, Battle of Agincourt, was the peak of a lot of the English victories in the war. And by that time, England controlled close to about half the actual country, like the northern part of France and part of western France. And they controlled a lot of the major cities, like Paris and Orleans, were all controlled, of course, by the English. So it looked like they were going to, eventually win the war, take it over, and all of that. But of course, one of the things that happened that really changed the war. Here's a picture of some reenactors with longbows. But of course, there was Joan of Arc, who of course everybody's heard of, who was a major, individual that really changed the course of the whole war. Anyway, Joan of Arc was a famous French heroine. Died very young. She was like 19 when she died. But she was very important because she helped to lift the siege of Orleans, which happened, I think, between 1428 and 1429. And it's a story they always tell where she supposedly had these visions where angels told her to basically help the King of France, who actually wasn't crowned yet. He would be later King Charles VII. I think they call it the Dauphin, and basically help him basically defeat the English. And so eventually Charles, I guess, believed her. And so he basically gave her this relief army that eventually attacked Orleans, where it was under siege by the English, which had lasted like half a year or so. And she eventually helped lift the siege and retake Orleans. And so that played kind of a vital role because over time, what of course would happen, I think that French victory at Orleans would eventually lead to the French winning the war. Because over time, within a 20-year period or more, the English start losing all their battles after that. They don't really win any more battles. And the English eventually get driven out of France. I think the only thing they have left is maybe like around Calais or something like that across from England. But over time, they eventually lose all their territory that they had gained in the war. And so France would be defeated pretty much, and both countries would permanently separate, England and France. If you know about Joan of Arc, she got captured by the Burgundians, who were an ally of the English, and they sold her basically to the English. And then the English put her on trial, accused her of witchcraft. Like those weren't angels, that was the devil or demons. They were telling you, I guess, to do that. And so they had her burned at the stake, if you know about that, in 1431. She, I think, was maybe 19, they believe. And, of course, later on, as you know, the Catholic Church canonized her. She's now Saint Joan of Arc, as you know. And she's considered one of France's greatest heroes. Up there with Napoleon and a bunch of other famous military-style leaders and all that. And I think a few years ago, they claimed that they found her remains, like her ashes. But they now think it's likely not, I think. So anyway, kind of talking about the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War is an interesting war. It's like considered one of the first modernized wars, because the fact that, they start using a lot of new kind of weaponry. And I think by the time you get down to the end of the 100 Years' War, which ended about, I guess, 1400s, mid 1400s, it's starting to look like a more regular modern war, like using cannon. And I think even going to start like muskets kind of coming in, or early primitive type guns they're starting to use at that point. All right, I need to go, of course, move on. I need to talk about, lastly, one more thing, of course, lecture-wise. And that, of course, is the Renaissance, of course, which is very well known. Anyway, the Renaissance, that started really in the 14th century. It started in Italy, like early 1300s. And of course, there's a little definition of the Renaissance right there. It's a period basically where in European history, there was this transition that occurred between the Dark Ages, the medieval Dark Ages, that Petrarch coined a long time ago. And it's a transition period into the modern age or modern times. They always talk about the fact that the term Renaissance is a term meaning a rebirth, because it was this rebirth of culture, art, science, math, and everything that was kind of brought to the forefront at that time. So it's a cultural movement, of course, that started in Italy and then it spread to like parts of Europe. So it's mostly a European type movement that occurred. And the Renaissance was heavily influenced by a lot of the old pagan culture, Greco-Roman culture. They often call it the classical revival. It's one of the names they dub it. And all the intellectuals that got involved in it, like the artists and the writers and things like that, a lot of them were called humanists, is what they were dubbed. The movement was called humanism, the people that were kind of involved in being scholars with the Renaissance. And Christian Europe began to be more secular, and they began to kind of restudy the past, like Roman culture, Greek culture, the Byzantine Empire's culture. They even got stuff through the Arabs in the Middle East as well. And it's believed that a lot of the Renaissance started in cities like Florence. Florence was believed to be the birthplace of where a lot of the Renaissance started, but Genoa, Venice, Milan, even Rome, all those cities were areas where a lot of the Renaissance got started. And Florence was considered to be like the center of the medieval European trade and finance. It's also where a lot of the early culture kind of started with the Renaissance. They talk about Florence being like the version of the medieval version of Athens, you want to call that, at the time. So it's the whole birthplace, of where the Renaissance got started, like I say. And how did it actually start? They believe that what happened was like in Italy, in places like Florence, they had these rich families like the Medicis or the Borgia family that basically began to take a lot of their wealth and they showed it off. Like, hey, I want to show off all my wealth, so I'll hire all these painters and sculptors to do all this kind of work. And so that's actually how it worked. All these people became patrons of artists, and that kind of spread the whole Renaissance from there. First started, of course, in Florence with it. And a lot of these Renaissance families were even popes. I think with those two families right there, the Medicis and the Borgia family, I think had at least 5 popes between them, like around that time, like in the Renaissance period. So like I'm saying, the actual intellectuals or artists were called humanists, which was part of this humanism thing. And the humanists were like these artists or secular artists and writers that began to concentrate more on like human nature, like dealing with humans on earth, secular things over like, say, like the supernatural or religion. So they were more concerned with things that humans were doing on earth in general. And it's believed that the father of humanism was Petrarch, who I've kind of talked about before. Petrarch was an Italian poet and writer that lived in the 1300s in Italy. And he was the guy that I told you had coined the term the medieval dark ages. That's what he called it, basically. Anyway, Petrarch was one of the first to actually begin restudying a lot of the Greco-Roman culture. So he began actually rereading stuff that had been around before. A lot of people had not done that before much because the church had kind of prevented that, and people wanted people to study the Bible and religion and things like that, and not really concentrate on pagan stuff, from a long time ago. He began reading stuff like that and translating it like into Italian and so on, and so he made it more widely available to people. And artists also began to copy a lot of the old writers as well. Like Dante copied, like, I think, Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, as an example. They first had the early Renaissance. That was the early stage, really, of the Renaissance, which was primarily in Italy, like Florence and other cities in northern Italy is where the Renaissance actually got started. And Dante Alighieri, of course, you've heard of him. Dante was considered one of the first great poets, like in Italy, who lived in the 1300s or died in the early 1300s. He actually knew, Petrarch. He also knew Boccaccio. They all kind of knew each other. They lived about the same time period. They consider Dante to be one of the greatest poets in the Middle Ages. If you know about it, he's the one who wrote the Divine Comedy, which is well known today. Just about everybody studied that, the Divine Comedy. And the Divine Comedy was an epic that was like a medieval epic that was kind of a copy of Virgil's Aeneid. Like, it was heavily influenced by the Aeneid, which was a book about really the medieval idea of what the afterlife was, which it went into like the 3 different realms, heaven, purgatory, and hell. And he divided into 3 books where Virgil was the main character, of course, involved in it, that would lead them, of course, through those 3 different levels. Paradiso, Purgatorio, and Inferno, of course, which were the actual names of the actual 3 books that were written. So Divine Comedy, of course, written by, of course, Dante. They also had Boccaccio, of course, Giovanni Boccaccio, his full name, was another Italian writer who also lived around the same time, about the 14th century. And he was famous for a series of short stories that he published later that was called Decameron, which was written around the same time of when they had the Black Death in Europe. And I think it was influenced by it. It was a series of stories where I think 10 people sat in a nearby little village waiting out the Black Death. They sat around telling stories, like to waste time, that kind of thing. That's mostly what it's about. Donatello, he's not a writer, but he was, of course, a famous Italian sculptor. Was also well known at the beginning of the Renaissance. He lived up to the 1400s, and he was very famous for being one of the first sculptors to kind of copy or emulate the old Greco-Roman art of making statues, like Venus de Milo and all that, where they depicted nudity. So he was actually one of the first to actually do that, which you see a lot in the Renaissance. And Donatello's most famous statue was of a youthful David, killing Goliath with his, killing Goliath and all that. And that's basically the other version of David, which Michelangelo also did as well. Also Machiavelli, I'll mention him real quick. He was also in the Renaissance as well. He lived up between the 15th and 16th centuries, and he was actually more of a political writer and theorist. He was also an historian. He was also an Italian diplomat, like in Florence. And he became very famous for his political treatise, which was called The Prince, which was published in around 1532. And that book was very famous for being one of the first modern political treatises that basically taught rulers how to rule, as a king or politician, I guess. And it's, of course, very influential later. Machiavelli talks about the fact that sometimes as a ruler, you got to rule in a ruthless manner just to stay in power. So you got to be, also very shrewd as well. So Machiavelli would later influence a lot of the modern rulers. I think it kind of led to even like absolutism or absolute type autocratic rulers that'll come later. All right, yeah, also I need to talk about what they call the High Renaissance that they have as well, because you have all these different artists that come in that are well known as well. Yeah, the High Renaissance was the peak of Italian art during the Renaissance, especially like in northern Italy and Rome as well. And a lot of the artists that were involved in the High Renaissance were considered masters, some of the greatest artists in that time, and sometimes even think of all time overall. And of course, I've got a bunch of these artists I can show you that are very famous. Of course, you have Leonardo da Vinci, of course, one of the most famous the different artists in Italy. He was, of course, a very famous, mostly known as a famous painter, of course. But he also, you can see, he did a lot of other things. He was a sculptor. He was an inventor. I guess famous Da Vinci notebooks, where he had a lot of invention ideas that kind of influenced people later. He was a scientist. He was an architect. He designed buildings, like in Florence. And of course, he was known for different paintings. His most famous painting, of course, he created was the Mona Lisa, which you see there, just now in the Louvre. Some people think it's one of the greatest paintings ever made. It's, not very large painting. I don't think it was ever finished. I think they say most of the paintings that Da Vinci did were actually incomplete. And that was now in the Louvre, of course, in Paris, France. And it ended up I think France the first bought it at one point in France and brought it to eventually to France. And I think for a long time it ended up in the Palace de Versailles, Chateau Versailles. And Louis XIV kept it in his bathroom originally. Also, of course, they had the Da Vinci's the Last Supper. That's, of course, one of the things one of his greatest things that he did, Da Vinci, where he depicted the Last Supper with Jesus and his disciples. Now, I think the scene is about where Jesus says that he's been betrayed. Then, of course, Michelangelo, of course, another famous artist, of course, well known, mostly as a sculptor. Of course, they think that the statue of David, which you see on the right there, is considered to be the greatest statue ever made, probably in the whole Renaissance. And but if you know about Michelangelo, he also was known as a painter. Of course, one of the most famous things that Michelangelo did as an artist, he was the one that painted the Sistine Chapel in Rome, part of St. Peter's Basilica. And Sistine Chapel, of course, is famous today, if you know about it. That's where they actually pick the popes. Like the cardinals will choose a pope when the pope dies or steps down. And that's why that chapel is kind of important today. Here's another piece right here, of course, the Sistine Chapel, famous painting, of course, he did. I think that's one on the ceiling, which is the creation of Adam. That's well known. And he's also known for another painting he did later in his career called The Last Judgment, the Sistine Chapel, which is on the behind the altar. It's one of the most famous scenes he did, which kind of, I guess, shows like maybe, I guess it's supposed to be like heaven and hell and all that. But the painting's famous for having a lot of nudity in it, if you know about this. And later on, he was actually forced to go back and cover up some of the nudity in it because of the fact that the Counter-Reformation started at that time, the 16th century, and the church was kind of trying to stop all this obscene stuff or nudity, I guess they thought at the time. Then another artist was Raphael Sanzio. He used to call him Raphael for short. Raphael Sanzio of Urbino, I think is the full name. And he was also very famous, too, for painting the Sistine Chapel, just like Michelangelo did. But Raphael is very, very famous for painting the Virgin Mary, which they call the Madonna. That's one, of course, in the Sistine Chapel called the Madonna Sistine. And then they also have the one here called Madonna the Chair. That one's pretty famous, too, also about Raphael. And one thing that's famous about Raphael, Michelangelo, and Da Vinci, you know what they have all in common? They're all Ninja Turtles. And Donatello also as well. Of course, that's true about that. That's modern times. But anyway, just kind of, all the different, periods of the Renaissance. They do have also what they call the Northern Renaissance. That was kind of like the third wave, I guess, of the Renaissance, which kind of spreads north of the Alps into what is Spain, Germany, France, England, all those areas right there. And so you get different Renaissances. Like they have a French Renaissance, a German Renaissance. There's an English Renaissance all over the place that actually occurs. So yeah, the French go through a Renaissance, and up to like Louis XIV's time, a lot of stuff is kind of influenced by the Italians, like Italian art, music, and architecture, things like that. As an example, Germany, they had, of course, all kinds of influences. Erasmus, you may have heard of him. He was a famous philosopher. He was heavily influenced, of course, by the Renaissance overall. Johann Gutenberg was influenced by the Renaissance. And of course, he's the one who invented the modern printing press in Europe, the so-called movable type printing press, which was influenced by the Chinese, in the East. And then even Martin Luther, in Germany, was influenced by the Renaissance to start his, Protestant Reformation and all that, which occurred in the early 1500s. Yeah, the Elizabethan era, people don't think about that, but that's also another case where, that was influenced by the Renaissance as well. So all these authors you're looking at, Geoffrey Chaucer, wrote Canterbury Tales, William Shakespeare, who, of course, created a lot of tragedies and other types of plays and poems as well. Sonnets and things like that were influenced, of course, by the Renaissance. And so is Christopher Marlowe, who was an English playwright as well, right before Shakespeare. So all those guys were basically, influenced by it. And universities, too, like a lot of universities, colleges, things like that, were, of course, heavily influenced by the Renaissance in the end. And yeah, those right there on the bottom, University of Paris, Cambridge, Oxford, universities in England, were some of the first medieval universities that kind of started developing like around the 13th century, because of, and then the Renaissance takes off later. So they were heavily influenced by that, in the end. So that's like the late, Middle Ages, all the different things that happened there overall. I do have a few minutes. I can kind of review over this period real quick for you and talk about, and that's pretty much it for this lecture. So who are the Mongols and the Mongol Empire? So the Mongols were an Asiatic people that came out of Mongolia, and in the 13th century, they formed the Mongol Empire, which would stretch from Asia into Europe, Eastern Europe. What were the Mongols called? They're called all kinds of names. People call them sometimes the Mongol Horde, that last part, because of all the different warriors, I guess, that fought on horseback. It would blot out the landscape. Golden Horde in Russia is another nickname. They called them there. Of course, the Mongols were also called the Devil's Horsemen. Genghis Khan was, of course, a famous Mongolian leader and ruler of the Mongols. He's the one that founded the Mongol Empire. They called him actually Temujin. Kublai Khan was his grandson. He would eventually go on to rule over Mongol China, which was called the Yuan dynasty that would rule over it. The Golden Horde was a khanate that was founded by Batu Khan. He was a grandson of Genghis Khan, and it was a vassal state which the Russians were forced under, which they were ruled by the Mongols and the Tatars for a couple centuries, 2 or 3 centuries actually. Timurid Empire was a Turkish Mongol type state that ruled over what is mostly like Iran, Iraq, and part of like close to Western India. It was founded by this ruler named Timur. They call it Timur the Lane, but in the West they later called him Tamerlane. Yeah, Tamerlane. For some reason the screen didn't come up, which I don't know why exactly, but those are the questions from this slide, which are right here. I don't know what happened to the screen, but for some reason it stopped sharing. But there it is right there. But anyway, so yeah, those are the questions from that slide, which are right there. Then, of course, you've got the other ones, which are, of course, the other slides. What were some major events of the late Middle Ages? I told you the Black Death, of course, which was the outbreak of the bubonic plague, was another thing that happened. The 100 Years' War, and then, of course, you had the Renaissance. What was the Black Death? The Black Death was a massive pandemic of bubonic plague that struck Europe and Asia in the mid-14th century, killed probably 100 million people worldwide, and probably at least 20 million or more in Europe. What caused the outbreak? It was caused by a bacterium or plague bacillus that's now called Yersinia pestis, which was in rat fleas. When you would bite it or whatever, it would give you the illness, and people would get the bobos as one of the symptoms of where the name came from. They called it all kinds of names: great pestilence, great death, mortality, etc. What kind of impact it had on Europe? Well, it basically wiped out a third of the population. 20 million or more died. And most people thought it was caused by something else, not medical. Like I told you, people believed it was bad smells, like miasma, the devil or God, the Jews did it, witches did it, or even some kind of astrology thing. But most people couldn't figure out what happened actually until really the end of the 19th century. They figured it out. 100 Years' War was a series of wars fought between England and France. About 116 years they fought off and on. And it was mostly between these two dynasties, one, the Plantagenets in England and the Valois in France, which fought for control of France. But eventually the French would beat them over time. Why was the war considered one of the first wars to introduce new weapons and all that? Yeah, it was the first modernized war because of new weapons that were invented. Like you had the longbow as an example, which was invented at, first developed at battles of Crécy, was used at in other battles. But they had like cannon being used, guns, like early gunpowder starts to come in, gunpowder weapons. They start using new kinds of catapults, siege engines. Who was Joan of Arc? Joan of Arc was a French heroine that eventually helped the French win the 100 Years' War. She was only a young maid. They called her the Maid of Orleans. is what they called her. That was her nickname, the Maid of Orleans. And anyway, she helped turn the tide in the battle that's called the Siege of Orleans in 1428-29, which was a major French city in northern France, Orleans. Yeah, Orleans, they say it. I think we say Orleans. And anyway, that battle was strategic because after the French won it, they took the rest of the France back afterwards. What historical period was believed to be the main catalyst that started the modern times? The Renaissance, which started in mostly northern Italy. Of course, it was seen as this rebirth of culture and art, where basically Europe stepped out of the medieval Dark Ages. It started in northern Italy, especially like Florence, Italy, the Republic of Florence, but also in other cities like Genoa, Venice, and so on, and even Rome later, where it started as well. Humanists, or the humanism movement, was a movement where artists, writers and so on, were kind of more secular, and they did art based on like mostly cultural things on earth in general, rather than the theology or supernatural as much. The Renaissance was divided into different periods. They had the early Renaissance, which was mostly in Italy between like the 14th, 15th centuries. They had the High Renaissance. That was the peak of the Renaissance, which was in the early 16th century, like 1500 to about 1530s. And they had also the Northern Renaissance, where the Renaissance spread to the rest of Europe, Germany, Spain, France, England, etc. Who are some famous artists and their works that are contributed to this period? Well, the High Renaissance had the master artists I told you about, like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Then the other ones I told you, don't forget, were Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, Picasso, Decameron. I think I told you about Donatello, had like the famous statue of David, like one of them anyway, the earlier statue of David. What else I talked about? Petrarch, don't forget about Petrarch. Petrarch, of course, don't forget him, Italian poet and writer, was the father, of course, of humanism. He's one they think helped start the Renaissance and all that. But Michelangelo was famous for like the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper. Da Vinci was famous for the Last Supper and Mona Lisa. Michelangelo was famous for the statue of David, and also painting the Sistine Chapel. Raphael was also famous for painting the Sistine Chapel, and also famous for painting like depictions of like the Virgin Mary, also known as Madonna. So anyways, kind of reviewing there what we, of course, lectured with the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages anyway, with this lecture. So that's pretty much it for my last lecture, of course, on the Middle Ages. So this will actually conclude the amount of lecture material, of course, for the final exam, which I am going to allow students, like I said, to start, taking the final on Monday, November 23rd. And the final exam will, of course, be due. I'm going to leave it open until looks like Thursday, December 3rd at midnight. So that's how long you have to get it done. And don't forget, if you're exempt from the final, you still got to turn in your final vocab. So get that to me. You can put it in the speed grader or email it to me. Speed grader preferred, if you can. And then don't forget the second 7 weeks class. A bunch of you still got to do assignments like the book report. You got to do that, turn that in. You also need to turn in the, you have to finish up the, I think that early Roman quiz as well. You need to get done. And then after that, you can, of course, I think you have the final vocab like they have too as well. Pretty much all the final vocab is due on Monday, November 30th. And then don't forget the Veterans Oral History Project is also due by Monday, November 30th. So that's it for this lecture. I'm going to, of course, post this lecture to my YouTube channel on Monday, November 23rd. And so that'll be the last lecture, like I said, toward the final exam. So I hope you have had a good semester. I know it's like, we couldn't meet face to face, because of the COVID, the virus and all that. But I hope you'll have a good break coming up. Thanksgiving, Christmas, and and all that, and have a happy new year. Maybe next year will be better, hopefully. So y'all take care and have a great rest of the semester.